The Bob Murphy Show, episode 341.
There's a tidal wave coming. What you gonna do?
Get ready for another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. It's your source for commentary and interviews conducted by a Christian and economist. Now here's your host, Bob Murphy.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Bob Murphy Show. Today I'm going to be speaking with Vance Ginn, who is a leading economist and advocate for free market principles and fiscal conservatism, shaping policies across the U.S. through his work with 15 think tanks. As the founder and president of Ginn Economic Consulting and host of the Let People Prosper podcast, Dr. Ginn provides high-impact economic consulting and dives deep into pressing issues with top influencers. He's got experience as the Associate Director for Economic Policy at the White House's Office of Management and Budget, and he's been the Chief Economist at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. It was actually down in Texas where I met Vance when I was at Texas Tech. In today's episode, we're going to be focusing on one of Vance's projects, which is a proposal to keep state governments from overspending, and we'll just let Vance describe it as we get into the interview. Here we go. Vance, welcome back to the Bob Murphy Show.
Hey, Bob, it's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, what we're going to talk about, folks, today is Vance has been working on sustainable budgets, or the lack thereof. And so I'll just turn it over to you. Can you just kind of give a general overview of what this issue is?
Yeah, definitely. As you know, Bob, we have a spending problem at the federal level. Most of your audience will know that as well. We've got $35 trillion in national debt. We're overspending, and so we have deficits of $2 trillion for the foreseeable future. Major problems. We can get into some of that as well, as we need reform of Social Security and Medicare. But we also have problems at the state and local level, too. I mean, in Texas, where I live, the state has done a pretty good job of spending over time, more of a sustainable budget, as I like to call it. But a lot of local governments, including the People's Republic of Austin, have not. And so all that means that since spending is taxation, right? At the end of the day, so we're going to pay for it somehow. We've got to get control over the spending. So sustainable budgeting is something that I've been working on in Texas and other states with Americans for Tax Reform at the national level, but really looking at a way to rein in government spending to better meet the average taxpayer's ability to pay for it. One good measure of that historically, Bob, has been population growth plus inflation. I happen to think that's too high. Most of the time, we need to be cutting government spending, not growing it at all. But at least it puts in some rules of the game in the institutional framework that reins in excessive government spending over time. And if you look at it, over the last decade, I've done some work on this at atr.org/budget project. There have only been 6 states that have kept spending within population growth plus inflation over the last decade. Those are Alaska, Colorado, North Dakota, Oklahoma, Texas, and Wyoming, all mostly red states. So that's one thing of fiscal conservatism. But even Colorado, place that's now blue, right, has been held in check by the Taxpayer Bill of Rights that was passed in 1992. So I think sustainable budgeting is really important, Bob, not only for the states and local governments, but for us as taxpayers, and ultimately at the end of the day at the federal level.
So a lot there. Just focusing narrowly for the moment on the 6 states that managed to meet this threshold. It seemed a lot of them were resource rich. Excuse me. Do you think that has anything to do with it, or is it more of an institutional thing?
It could have some things to do with it. I've looked at that in some of my past studies. And you're right. Alaska, there's a lot of oil and gas. North Dakota, Oklahoma, Texas, Wyoming, not necessarily Colorado. But even the states that have held their state funds within population plus inflation, you look at Louisiana, Massachusetts, Montana, North Carolina, Ohio, and Rhode Island, are not necessarily resource-rich states there. And so I think although they are correlated, there's not a causality there. Just because they're resource rich doesn't mean that points them in the direction of sustainable budgeting. And so I really think it's more about their institutional framework, more fiscal conservatism. And so I think that really helps out a lot. And one of the points that could be for the resource purpose is that you have a lot of volatility, right? More oil, whenever there's a lot of oil production, you have more revenue coming in. But I should mention that in Texas, the amount of revenue from oil and gas activity is only about 9% of the overall budget. So, I mean, there's a lot of other, sales taxes and other things that are coming in, whereas Oklahoma is closer to 25%. So you could have some reductions there given the years in which oil production is not as high. But I don't think that's the main driving factor of keeping these budgets in check.
Okay, and again, just to be clear, your metric isn't tax revenue; it's spending.
Correct.
Right. So even on like a priori grounds, it's not obvious why a state that has a lot of I mean, you might even think it'd be the other way around. Like as you're saying that maybe when times are good and oil prices or natural gas prices are high, they spend more and then, they get into trouble. So, okay.
Yeah,
fair
exactly.
enough. So this might be obvious to people, but why don't we just not assume? Can you just spell out why are you taking the benchmark of population growth plus inflation to be a decent approximation as a first cut as to what does it mean to have a sustainable budget?
Yeah, the one reason why to look at it is because of the historical precedent that's been set with Colorado and others, Sweden, the Swiss debt break, and some other things that have been used for population plus inflation. But I think from economic terms, it also makes sense when you look at the average taxpayer's ability to pay for government spending, or look at it from an economic indicator standpoint. Let's start there first. Some places, even in Texas, use personal income growth, right? And so personal income is basically population growth plus inflation plus productivity. Just similarly measure that you can measure it for GDP as well. The problem is you have population growth. That makes sense. More people, more ability to pay for government spending if there is a need. And then inflation, that's another measure to use. I also like to think of it as wage growth. Historically, wage growth and inflation have grown together, not so much here in the last couple of years, but historically that's been the case. But productivity, if you think about productivity, it's hard for me to argue or to find data supporting an increasing productivity for government. So if you think of it from the government sector, I would think that term is either going to be negative or zero without increases in productivity over time. If you think about it from the private sector, if the private sector is more productive, and that's a positive term there, then you would want more dollars at the margin to be in the private sector, not in government. So again, that would be negative. So if you just make it zero, what are you left with? Population growth plus inflation. And so I think in economic terms, that makes sense. Also, if you think a little bit about, economies of scale, we don't need a new school every time new people are there. We don't need a new road and things of that nature. And that also is a reason why I argue that you shouldn't use the productivity measure at the end, and then you're just left with population growth plus inflation as a maximum for a sustainable budget. And many states have now started to use this more, and I've been using this with a lot of think tanks across the country. But yeah, that's really where I brought the philosophical perspective of it.
Okay, great. And so again, it's pretty common sense, straightforward measure this thing. Given whatever a state is spending right now, to then say going forward, let's not in a sense become bigger relative to everything else going on, just to keep it kind of like at its current level. It would be unfair. It would be too harsh to say freeze spending at the current level, because just with inflation, a given expenditure in dollar terms is going to mean less over time if prices in general are going up, 3% a year. But then also with the population growth, it would be, silly to expect the state government to not spend more even as the population is growing, because wherever their services are, you got to spend more. And then on the flip side, the ability of the people to sustain such spending in general, if you think there's inflation, and yes, as you noted, sometimes there is a mismatch, but generally speaking, if prices are higher over a 20-year stretch, then nominal wages and salaries are going to be higher too. So the public can better afford to pay the taxes needed to finance that. And then the more people there are, the more, that can kind of spread that tax burden.
Yeah. And one thing I should mention there too is it's always a maximum, right? I do like the idea of freezing, just nominal terms, the level of spending or cutting it. Another way that I put this, though, with population growth plus inflation, when you adjust them, you're essentially freezing spending per person in inflation adjusted terms, right? So it is freezing it in that sense.
Yeah. Do you I'm unfamiliar with this literature, so sorry if this is like pedantic stuff, but like, do some people recommend things like as a share of the economy? Like, is that another way you could say, given whatever state spending is right now as a share of state product, then, just don't let it get higher than that?
Yes. Yeah. Share of GDP. Some would say, well, maybe let's use the last 5-year average. Yeah. At the national level, there has been a share of debt to GDP ratios, right? As let's increase spending more than that, depending on what the revenue comes in. There's also been other ideas about a structural balance. So for a couple of years, you run a surplus or a deficit, and then you run a surplus for a few years to make up for that balance. Because 49 out of the 50 states, Bob, have a balanced budget amendment. The only one is Vermont, kind of the duck that doesn't have it, the black duck, if you will. But all the rest of them have a balanced budget amendment. So they've got to, or some sort of requirement. So that means that they've got to have a balanced budget. So really spending is equal to taxes in this sense, to where they can't issue their own currency like the federal government can, or run massive deficits. So it's important to think about how to limit that spending, so therefore you don't have to tax as much. And what's kind of interesting about this is that after working with a number of in Texas and other states, is when you can start to have more sustainable budgeting and spending less, it also allows for more tax relief. So there's a lot of states that are coming up with these ideas, like North Carolina, Louisiana. Some other states have come up with these ideas of revenue triggers. If we hit this revenue trigger for general revenue, the part of the budget where states have the most discretion over, and this one for the rainy day fund, and maybe another one that they'll add in there, then we can cut taxes. But to me, that puts the focus on the wrong thing. There's not a revenue problem, there's a spending problem. And so if we could focus in on restraining spending to something like sustainable budgeting and population plus inflation, the revenue will come in faster than that because the economy is growing faster. Mm-hmm. And then you can use the surplus to buy down, reduce your taxes, reduce your income taxes over time.
You had a throwaway line there, and I don't know if this is something that you have a lot of details on, and I noticed this back when I worked for Arthur Laffer, and I did, he was his economic model and the way his portfolio selection for stocks and things and so on in an investment sense is based on different metrics of U.S. state performance, right? Not just looking at countries, but states. So that's when I was hip deep in this stuff, and I've gotten a little bit away from it, but it always struck me. It's odd that you said that 49 states have balanced budget amendments, and yet you can read about, for example, California's got a such and such $1 billion deficit right now, and what's Newsom going to do? So what do we mean when we say every state except, what was it, Vermont? Did you say is the outlier?
Yep.
Have a balanced budget amendment, and yet we know like Illinois too would get in trouble. Like, what does that mean when you say they have a balanced budget amendment?
Yeah, it's a great point, Bob. I mean, what it means is whenever they go to make their appropriations during the budget process, that their revenue has to equal their appropriations. Now, at the end of the day, once they go through that fiscal year, their spending may not equal the revenue that they projected a year ago, or in some cases 2 years ago. Like in Texas, they always do it 2-year biennium. And so these are based on projections of a balanced budget that may not be the actuals later on. And that's what happened in California, is they didn't see the same economic growth that they thought. And they had more spending than what they had projected. And that is the deficit that they have to close later on, meaning they have to cut spending or raise taxes in order to cut that, to do something with that later. And one thing that, Laffer and others have talked about over the years is kind of the Brownback issue in Kansas, where in 2013, they had these substantial tax cuts in Kansas. And over the next couple of years, they ended up running into trouble where they ran deficits. And so in 2017, they raised taxes again, and everybody said, whoa, man, this is why we shouldn't cut taxes, because we got to raise them later on. And this was a fraud. This is what happens when you cut taxes. But the real problem was excessive government spending. They never balanced their budget over time, and then they decided to raise taxes, which put them in a worse position later on. So it's all based on a lot of games, Bob, with the amount of budget through the budget process of projections versus actuals. But at the end of the day, it all has to equal. And that's why you see this wild fluctuations in some cases, like in California and Illinois.
Okay, so again, and I'm sure the states have the different nuances, whatever, but when people say balance, but it doesn't literally mean that because I haven't even really thought that through, that how can they, you kind of got to know ahead of time how much you're going to spend, but yet it is, you can't, it's hard to forecast. It's not like they're just getting a paycheck month in and month out from their Fortune 500 employer. And so, how do they budget that? So those balanced budget amendment, those state things, it's not saying that literally it is illegal for the state to spend more in a given fiscal period than they take it in revenue. It's just that certain triggers get activated, and that, they can't just continually spend more than they take in.
Yep. And then they've got to close it at the end of the fiscal period, right? And so they'll find some budget maneuvers in order to do that. But you're right. It's not ironclad that there's no deficits or no surpluses, but that is what they have to budget with when they go into the budget process and say, okay, we're going to sign this General Appropriations Act. It's got to be revenue neutral, or in this case, deficit neutral, zero, no deficit, balanced budget. And
Right.
for example, in Texas, we have it to where the comptroller comes in and certifies the budget and says, okay, here's what we're projecting. And then they'll certify that what the spending is. And so there's other things that happen across the country in different states.
Okay. So I think it's fair to say that your point here, or one big takeaway, is you think that we're trying to constrain Leviathan, that spending is really more important than other possible issues?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, my point is that, and I think you said that, and others have too, of where government spending is the disease. The taxes are a symptom of that disease. And Milton Friedman said government spending is the ultimate burden of taxation, or the ultimate burden of government is government spending. And I believe that's the case. You can change taxes all you want and other things, but it all goes back to spending. In fact, if we weren't spending the money on all these different agencies at the federal level or the state level or local level, we couldn't regulate either. And so it still goes back to spending as being the main problem of this. And I know you like to talk about monetary policy and the Fed a lot, like I do. And if the Fed wasn't running if Congress wasn't running massive deficits, we would have less ammunition for the Fed to buy that debt in order to issue currency and run up inflation and create distortions and everything else, the Austrian business cycle, right? And so it goes back to spending as kind of being the prime mover. Talking about Aristotle, the prime mover of what's happening here really goes back to Congress.
Hey, folks, let's take a break from the action to talk about the ExPat Money Summit. Now, this is an entirely online summit. It's occurring from October 7th through 11th. It's put on by Mikkel Thorpe, who's host of the ExPat Money Show and a highly sought-after expat consultant with over 2 decades of experience. At this summit, you'll learn why international diversification is a must for those looking to preserve their liberty and wealth. You'll learn everything you need to know about crafting your perfect Plan B, how to quickly acquire a second passport, diversify your finances offshore, invest in international real estate, and get in-depth insights on geopolitics from world-renowned experts. These experts include speakers such as Dr. Ron Paul, Doug Casey, Scott Horton, Tom Woods, Mark Faber, Tom Luengo, and so forth. I'm actually participating in a VIP panel discussion, and again, you need the VIP pass to be able to check out that particular discussion, which was quite informative. I learned a lot. So to reserve your complimentary ticket, you go to expatmoneysummit.com. But if you want to see the discussion involving old me, then you got to get the VIP pass. Go to expatmoneysummit.com. Use promo code Murphy if you want to get a discount on the tickets and if you want to see my discussion on the VIP panel. Again, that's expatmoneysummit.com. Yeah, it's funny you're saying that because I just recorded an interview with Zach and Liz from the Reason podcast, just asking questions, and the ostensible topic originally was the federal debt, and I was going through all that and making points, but ultimately when when it came down to so what should they do, I said, well, they got to cut spending.
Yeah,
that's what's driving all this, and that in one sense, like spending, because even on its own terms, besides like what you're saying. You could kind of just do like an accounting framework and say that, given that the government's going to spend, how they finance it is almost a secondary thing, whether they tax now, because if they borrow it, that's in a sense just deferred taxation. And so, there's a timing element involved, but strictly speaking, you're not getting around the ultimate taxation. And even if they print the money, that's sort of just like a hidden tax. So really the fundamental thing is when the government, builds a bunch of tanks, those are real resources that could have been used in other activities that are now congealed in those tanks. And maybe in the grand scheme, you think that's a good use of those resources. Fair enough. But the point is that's a genuine opportunity cost. And to say, well, how is it financed? Because maybe then it doesn't matter. Like in one sense, that's kind of missing the point that no, when the government is, funneling food stamps or military production or whatever it is, that's resources that are getting redirected from other potential uses.
Yeah, no, exactly. And of course, as they run up those debts and deficits, they're issuing treasury securities that's putting supply in the market, driving the price down of those bonds and interest rates up, which means the orders of production, right, are also going to be influenced and distorted throughout that. So it's not only the direct manipulation or intervention from the government, but it's also the indirect through the interest rates. And so you almost get a double whammy from the excessive government spending that takes on. This is one reason why I harp on government spending so much, is that I truly believe it is the main problem that's driving so much of the government intervention and government failures throughout the economy. It just seems like everything they want to do is say there's a market failure, let's increase government spending to solve it, when it was a government failure problem usually that started it most of the time. And so if you try to put more government into it, you're exacerbating that initial government failure and creating a worse problem for consumers and producers, whether that be, in trade, in free trade. A huge advocate for free trade, I think, but they keep wanting to put tariffs in place and pointing the finger at others when we have three more pointing back at ourselves, and have too high of taxes, too much inflation, too much government spending. And now, Bob, we have this industrial policy complex, both the left and the right too often, of increasing government spending, where it's the CHIPS Act, or some on the new right want to claim that we need a new strong labor unions and these sort of things. It's going back to the failed progressive times of the past.
You had a throwaway line a minute ago about saying you think even regulation is driven by government. Can you just unpack that a bit? I have different possible things that maybe you meant, but
okay,
what did you mean besides me speculating?
Yeah. Well, one thing I meant is that whenever Congress passes a big bill, for example, the Affordable Care Act, a lot of that Affordable Care Act is done through regulations by Health and Human Services. Same thing happens at the state levels, though, too. Texas, they pass a big Medicaid reform or Medicaid changes bill, and a lot of those regulations will be the Texas Health and Human Services Commission that will make a lot of those changes. And so they end up doing some of the spending through the regulations that are put in place by Congress or by a state legislature. That's one part of it. Another part of it, though, is that had the state legislature or Congress not passed that budget in order to spend for regulations in that agency, then that agency wouldn't have been able to regulate. So not only does it create the regulations, but it increases spending through the regulations that they provide because of those regulators that are in the market that are there at that agency running whatever's in that bill.
Okay, got it.
Does that make sense?
Yes, definitely.
Okay, all right.
Okay, I know another topic you've been hitting lately is the issue of barriers to work. Can you speak on that?
Yeah, so barriers to work is another big one for me. You have spending, you have taxes and inflation, and then barriers to work is another big one. One of those being the minimum wage, continuing to ratchet up. Virginia is going to be up to $20 an hour by 2026. Same thing with California and New York. In Texas, where I'm at, it's still $7.25. I think it's one of 10 states, right around 10 states that follow the federal minimum wage at $7.25 an hour. And of course, if you have a higher minimum wage, that's setting a floor that's raising the price of work. And so I think this is a big regulation, a huge barrier to work that's contributing to many people fleeing the high tax, high regulatory, high cost of living states to lower tax, lower spending, lower regulation states. And that will continue. The other things, though, are things like occupational licensing. Louisiana just passed a bill this year that eliminated the occupational licensing to be a florist, of all things. Somehow flowers are going to kill you. I don't know. But that was been in place for many years. They finally got rid of that one. But there are other things, Bob, like cosmetologists. I don't have too much hair left, but what I do have left, I'm not too worried about what they're going to do to my hair. And if I do worry, if they cut me on the ear or something, I'm going to go to a different one. And so I think occupational licenses, there's just too many of them out there. And this hurts the lower skilled, lower income people the most because they don't have the time, the money and effort and everything else to spend all this time for a license and then jump through the hoops to get there. So we have these regulatory barriers like minimum wages, occupational licenses that put together kind of cartels that keep out a lot of those who need jobs and get their first job to move up the income ladder. Bob, when I was 16, I worked at Pilgrim Cleaners in Houston where I was tagging clothes and I was a cashier. And that helped to give me a lot of customer service skills to learn how to get to work on time. There's a lot that goes to that, even though I was getting the minimum wage, but I didn't earn that very long. And so these are all issues that I think we need to think about of barriers to work. And there's a lot more of them, high taxes, the antitrust sort of policy that doesn't allow for his competition, where government wants to come in and break things up. These really are at the expense of workers that I think we've got to remove out of government as much as possible, if not altogether. That's the kind of wishful thinking, but try to remove those as much as possible.
Yeah, I mean, it's the occupational license stuff. I understand, like from a conventional, normal person's perspective, they would naturally think that, oh yeah, I mean, you can't just have anyone being a brain surgeon or something, or an airplane mechanic or things like that, or a lawyer even. I understand. Like, so I have, as Vance, and my listeners know at this point, that I think private sector analogs of those sort of certification agencies would be much, much better, certainly in the long run. But I get that. But even on their own terms, stuff like, I mean, there's cases, I'm sure you're familiar with, Vance, of like African hair braiding, and some lady's been doing it. She's a grandmother at this point, has been doing it for decades. And then the local group of hairdressers votes and like, no, you can't do that anymore. And the government comes and shuts her down because she might braid someone's hair wrong. And what's the worst thing that could happen if she doesn't do it correctly? So
that's right.
I mean,
eyebrow threading. There's eyebrow threading now too.
Yeah. And like the florist is one I have. I mean, I can't even imagine what they. Yeah. So on the hairdresser stuff, I have seen pushback from people defending it and saying like, like for what you said, like you could cut somebody and you got to have sanitary things, or like you could transmit lice and blah.
Yeah.
Like, okay, fine, but the
florist, I think some of the chemicals they use for perms and stuff like that too, it could be a problem. I kind of get that. But if they do a bad job, just don't go back. I mean,
yeah.
The market works.
Yep. And of course, it doesn't solve the problem, right? It's not that. Yeah. See, so now if we just have a local board, and that's why there are no more cases of head lice in the United States, because fortunately all the states have regulated these hairdressers. I mean, that's not what happens. It's always a comparative analysis,
right? And those exams that they take are only on one day of the year. So what happens the other 364 days out of the year? They're supposedly they've been christened to say, look, they're going to be fine the rest of the year, but really it's only one day where they do that test.
Are you saying to like maintain their eligibility or their good standing? Oh, okay,
the good standing. So I mean, you got to take the test and then you renew the next year, and you show them all this information. But it's not like they're in let's say your hairdresser, right? They're not there with you in your store, in your shop every day of the year to make sure that you do a good job. It just gives you that thing that you can put up on the wall to say, I've got this certification. And so somehow now you're not going to make any mistakes. And the similar thing goes with doctors, and others, and those of us who have PhDs, I guess, everybody who has a PhD, that they know everything about economics or whatever, but at least we're not licensed in this case. But even for doctors, I mean, doctors make mistakes, medical doctors, that is, who are licensed. Not just because they have a license doesn't mean that they're going to be perfect every day. And I think that's what some try to claim, given the occupational licensing, they're pushed to have everything licensed nowadays. And one last thing there, Bob, is over the last 50 years, there's been this decline in labor unions, people who are a member of a labor union. I think it went from like 30% 50 years ago to about 6% in the private sector today. It's closer to 9% if you include federal workers, because all of them are part of federal labor union. But it's interesting because occupational licenses went from about 5% of the population to about 28% of the population. So there was an inverse relationship between the two, where people said, you know what, we're not going to have labor unions being a part of this and force people to pay dues and all that, but we're going to force them to go through all these hoops through occupational licenses instead and make it look better. But I still think there's so many issues that's going on out there with these licenses.
Okay, wow. I mean, I'm certainly aware of the trend among union membership, but I did not realize and it doesn't shock me that you're saying it went up, but I didn't realize that the numbers were so severe in terms of the number. So what was it you were saying, the percentage of workers who need some sort of occupational licensing?
Yes, about a quarter of them now. I think it's around 26%. I'll send you some information after this, but yeah, there's almost a direct inverse relationship between the two.
Huh. But hey, I have not died from getting a faulty bouquet lately.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to say, yep. Thank my lucky stars. Bernie
Yeah,
Sanders
that's right.
is looking out for me.
Yeah.
Okay, well, maybe the last thing I'll ask you here, we're just cognizant of the clock. So you had mentioned, the minimum wage is one of them. I'm just curious as to your thoughts. Have you looked much, because on Twitter right now, if you say raising the minimum wage will make it harder for teenagers to get hired, you're going to get a whole host of people who are conversant, not necessarily economists, but like policy wonk types who will come in and just laugh at you, and you're a dinosaur, and hey, 1990 called and they want your take back. And aren't you familiar? You're anti-scientific. This is just ideological. Everybody knows that the literature says raising the minimum wage doesn't hurt employment anymore. That's just a myth.
Yeah. Yeah. I get that all the time, as I know you do as well. But I think there's a couple things with that. I think for one thing, people don't understand who actually even gets the minimum wage. It's less than 3% of the workforce gets the minimum wage. And those who do, 55% of them from the last I've seen are 16 to 24-year-olds. So those are not the breadwinner of the household. Those are people they're at home and for high school or college, and their parents are helping them out and other things. And it's to get their foot in the door. But all of them to some extent, or sorry, not all of them, but the vast majority also don't have a high school diploma, right? Or very little college. And so you're thinking about a low skilled group there. But the other thing is that there is some research out there that shows there was no employment effects by, Card and Kruger back in the day. If I'm looking at this one entity versus another, and it's showing the comparison between the two. But the problem is, and some have started to write more on this, Bob, and you've probably seen this too, but it's about the distribution effects of who is actually influenced by the minimum wage. So whenever somebody goes, and let's say they raise the minimum wage up to $15 an hour, you take a place like McDonald's. McDonald's has a cashier who will take your order. And now what we've seen over time as minimum wages have went up and other things have went up too, is now there are more kiosks where you go and order on the kiosk instead of the cashier. Not all the cashiers lost their jobs. Maybe a few of them did, or there will be fewer opportunities for people to get jobs there later. But now there's a kiosk. A kiosk doesn't call in sick. Last time I checked, they are there all the time and they do a good job. They give the right returns and everything else. But who builds the kiosk? The upper income, upper skilled people, higher skilled people are. Who maintains the kiosk? The mid skilled or the mid paid job. And so you have some of the low skilled, low paid jobs that are moved out of the marketplace, while you have more mid skilled and high skilled jobs. And so it's a redistribution of those skills levels across the labor force. And so while there may not be a drop in employment, the distribution has now changed. And it's actually moved up the income level and not down the income level. And so I think what we're seeing is that, and you have an upward redistribution of income, which is often against what those who want a higher minimum wage want to reduce income inequality. You're actually contributing to more income inequality. And so I think this is another big issue that people oftentimes overlook with the minimum wage are the seen versus the unseen, right? What's to come, and there's been more evidence of that there are substantial costs to raising the minimum wage.
Yeah, and even to really, because I was really deep in this literature back when I was at Texas Tech, and my biggest regret from that experience was that I didn't get this nailed down and published while I was still there, because I knew, like, being in that academic environment, this is when it would have happened. So I still sometime want to return to that, maybe in my dotage, but there was something fishy. So folks, it's hard to explain it in everyday terms, but the idea was even this more revisionist literature, which was showing, oh, wait a minute, upon further review, it looks like raising the minimum wage, at least if it's modest, doesn't significantly reduce teen employment. Even on its own terms, the raw first cut regression analysis did show that, yes, the states that raised the minimum wage, that was statistically significant. But then they did like another pass and they controlled for all these other things. And then the effect kind of disappeared. And so then you're saying, well, what are they controlling for? And one of the things that the authors mentioned was automation. Yeah. And I was like, whoa. So I'm just tying it to what you said there, that at least, and so there, again, strictly speaking, like it was they had very technical mathematical papers. And then in the description, they're kind of just verbally trying to give the intuition. But to the extent that that's true, like strictly speaking, if you would, my understanding was they'd say, oh yeah, it does happen to be the case that when this state raised its minimum wage, that fewer workers were employed in the fast food sector there than in adjacent states that didn't raise the minimum wage. But when we looked into it, we said, oh, but you know what? The McDonald's and Burger Kings in this state also brought in a bunch of kiosks right around the same time. And so really you can't ding the minimum wage for that. Of course, they're going to hire fewer workers if they got a bunch of kiosks.
Right.
So, and it was like, I mean, I think everybody understands the problem with that particular technique. So anyway, that's what that like I said, though, I never could get a smoking gun. What I wanted to do was, Vance, like to really unpack it and kind of like do a simulation first where we're in the model, we know what's happening, and then show, so it wouldn't be that I would prove the minimum wage did it, but it would be more to say that particular excuse. Like in other words, the alleged corrections they were making to the raw regression analysis, which again did show, if you make labor more expensive, employers hire less of it. Imagine, who would have thought that the alleged corrections would be swamping the real effect if it were there. So that, again, that doesn't prove the effect is there, but it's just saying these statistical corrections or techniques are obfuscating the very thing that we're trying to unpack. But again, I can't run victory laps on that because I didn't quite nail that down before I was taken away. But in any event, speaking of being taken away, so we just got a minute or two here. I know we got a hard stop here, Vance. Where can people go if they want to see more of your work?
Yeah, Bob, it's always a pleasure to talk with you. And you mentioned Texas Tech. That was my alma mater. That's where I got my PhD in economics. It's a great spot. But everybody can go check me out at vanceginn.com. It's my website. I have my podcast there at Let People Prosper, which you can find on all the major platforms that are out there. You can also check out my newsletter, vanceginn.substack.com, where I talk about all these things and a lot more. And I work on issues from across the country at state level, federal level, and working a lot on sustainable budgeting, tax reform, occupational licensing, and reducing barriers to work. And school choice, too, is a big one for me, too, Bob. And so all these things are things I work on, and I'm glad to work on with anyone who's interested.
Okay, thanks, Vance, for your time and your insights. And thank you, folks, for tuning in. See y'all next time.
You've just experienced another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. For more information and to subscribe to this podcast, visit bobmurphyshow.com.